Thank you, Richard. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great, lovely. Okay, so the paper I'm going to give discusses internal British government correspondence concerning a number of incidents in the interwar years, by way of building a picture of the perceptions of Islam and Muslims that British officials had during that period. Of course, these perceptions didn't arise solely from the specific events being discussed here. They were built over more than 500 years of increasingly complex and immediate interaction. Cooperation between British and the Ottomans had been evident at a number of points, most obviously in the Crimean War, when the two had been allies against Russian expansionism. British East India Company rule and then the Raj required ongoing cooperation between company and imperial officials, as well as both Hindu and Muslim officials, lawyers, community leaders, and landowners. Relations between the differing elements of the imperial apparatus and Muslim leaders, the ulama and community representatives, were therefore wide-ranging. At the same time, deep suspicions remained. Suspicions of the Enlightenment agenda that the British brought in education, for example, which caused Muslims to open their own schools, most notably the Darul Uloom in Deoband and the Aligarh School. Furthermore, there was strong suspicion amongst British officials that the so-called Indian Mutiny, or First War of Independence, had been organized and coordinated by Muslim noblemen. There had also been the Mahdi rebellion in the Sudan in the 1880s, and the British believed that the ideology of pan-Islamism, preached by Al-Afghani and encouraged by the Ottomans, was a constant threat to the loyalty of imperial Muslim subjects. A threat that was realized when the Ottoman Caliph Sultan declared war in 1914 in terms of a jihad, seeking to encourage Muslims under British and Allied rule to fight for the Ottomans. In the event, very few did. Over a third of the Imperial Indian Army, divisions of which fought in both the Western Front and the Middle East theatre against the Ottomans, was comprised of Muslims, somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 men, and the overwhelming majority of them remained loyal to British rule. Indeed, one rebellion in Singapore and the Silk Letter conspiracy is all that seems to have transpired. This brings us to the period in question, and three key issues dominated in relation to the British and their imperial Muslim subjects. Firstly, the fate of the defeated Ottoman Caliph Sultan and the Khilafat movement which it prompted was a particularly sensitive and important concern. It was an issue which predominated through the period of the peace treaty negotiations, which rumbled on into the late 1930s, following the Caliph's death in exile in 1937. Secondly, was the development of the relationship with new states which had been carved out of former Ottoman territory, and ensuring access to the oil that was recently discovered in that region. In this, they were in a race with the Americans, and ultimately hamstrung by their own belief that there was no oil in Saudi Arabia. Third was the rise of the Indian independence movement, and with it, from 1930 onwards, the demand from Indian Muslims for a land of their own. This, then, was the backdrop to a period which also saw the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent rise of totalitarianism. A period also where the world sought to cooperate internationally to solve disputes in the shape of the League of Nations. The interwar years were, therefore, a time in which competing ideologies struggled for attention and loyalty as the nascent liberal international order sought to assert itself at the deliberate expense of empire. As the historian Adam Tooze observes in his brilliant book, The Deluge, quote, "The war bequeathed an unprecedented problem of global economic and political order, but no historical model of world hegemony with which to address it," close quote. It is therefore unsurprising that Muslims were amongst those thinking through social political responses to governance questions in this new spirit. Their responses, using tools from within Islam rather than within Western liberal democracies, led to the founding of at least two movements which were to have profound long-term impact: the Muslim Brotherhood and the Tablighi Jamaat, both founded in the late 1920s. Yet they were only two amongst a number of transnational Islamic networks which began to emerge, which related to pan-Islamism in this period on mainland Europe, as well as in the Middle East and South Asia. These movements were driven by newspapers, travel, and pilgrimage, along with individual activists, such as the Lebanese-born politician and noble Shaqi Arslan, whose advocacy on behalf of pan-Islamism and the Ottoman Empire was substantially influential. Anecdotal proof of this lies in his presidency of the European Islamic Congress held in Geneva in 1935, a meeting which was instrumental in developing Muslim networks and building Muslim transnational consciousness, as discussed in Clare and Germain's Islam in Interwar Europe. In many ways, therefore, the ideal of pan-Islamism fostered before the First World War, rather than being suppressed by the Ottoman defeat, the abolition of the Caliphate and breakup of the Ottoman Empire, was perhaps even enhanced and invigorated by it, for it continued to develop in ways that echoed the demands of fresh thinking about international cooperation and self-determination. It was against this background that British politicians and officials engaged with a vast range of issues relating to Islam and Muslims during the interwar years. What follows, therefore, is a discussion of a few incidents which hopefully give a flavour of the British engagement with Muslims in a range of contexts. In order to do so, I will use the lens of Johann Matthew's excellent article on British imperial policy in the interwar period, and discuss his contention that, quote, the spectre of pan-Islamism helped to crystallize a methodological nationalism in imperial policies over Muslim populations in this period, close quote. By methodological nationalism, Matthew is meaning a policy of specifically encouraging national localism in order to counter the transnational Muslim consciousness, which had already been alluded to in relation to the Khilafat movement and the European Islamic Conference. Matthew argues that British officials were paranoid about the threat of pan-Islamism, but that the threat was greatly exaggerated. Pan-Islamism as an ideology being confined to a relatively small number of Muslim intellectuals that found little ground in the wider Muslim consciousness of the time. He bases his argument upon the perception that British officials, faced with unrest across Muslim majority areas in the period after the First World War, and the sheer range and scope of the unrest that convinced them that there was a coordinated international pan-Islamic conspiracy, which was being encouraged by agents of the new Russian Bolshevik regime. To that end, perhaps it is not surprising that, or interesting to note that one of the first things that was done by the new Bolshevik regime was to send a telegram to all Muslim leagues around the British Empire, encouraging them to work with the Bolsheviks to end imperialism. Matthew diligently researches the work of the Interdepartmental Committee on Eastern Unrest, created in 1922, to provide empire-wide analysis on security threats as the principal source for his argument. It's a bold claim, and one which rightly highlights the fact that scholarship on intellectual or elite movements can sometimes exaggerate their wider impact, and also rightly contends that the British government's strategy of national engagement rather than pan-imperial engagement evidences the size of the threat British government officials believe they faced at the time. Matthew notes the summary of threats which become the foundation for his argument that the British response of methodological nationalism was appropriate given the nature of the threat they believe they faced. I quote here Matthew's summary. Quote, "In the extensive imperial correspondence on pan-Islamism, the persistent refrain is that pan-Islamic and Bolshevik sentiments are insincere and are merely the efforts of educated elites to exploit and deceive the masses. Second, the sense that nationalism would continue to be a problem reflects their belief that the transnational movements were illusionary epiphenomena, capitalizing on a unique confluence of circumstances to oppose British power, whereas nationalism had real substance, wide appeal, and perhaps even an aura of inevitability. As the third conclusion indicates, officials saw educated elites as the only part of their population with agency, elites that would naturally adopt nationalism in their own interests, but would not wholeheartedly sympathize with pan-Islamism. The full statement encapsulates how a nationalist sentiment amalgamated into an international threat, something that was easily divisible to its component parts, but more dangerous when coordinated. I would contend that there were a number of other geostrategic considerations which also suited a move towards national rather than transnational policies in relation to British engagement with Muslims and Islam, and that over the scope of the whole interwar period, the threat of pan-Islamism was actually sublimated rather than being a central driver of British interwar policy. In particular, I believe that concerns about pan-Islamism were given less consideration than concerns over the views of Indian Muslims specifically. So I will argue that methodological nationalism was not simply a policy born to counter Islamic transnational consciousness and the threat posed by Bolshevik destabilizing activities, but that it responded to changing international circumstances and was focused upon one territorial group of Muslims over others, Indian Muslims. In other words, that British government policies that impacted Muslims during this period were undoubtedly influenced by, but not wholly based upon, the perceived threat posed by pan-Islamism and its believed coordination with Bolshevism and other revolutionary forces, but that it also reflected the need to deal with individual Muslim groups and states whose relationship the British especially required. Furthermore, I believe that Matthew's observations about British policy, whilst extremely valuable, are drawn too heavily on an intelligence perspective, and that away from the admittedly influential intelligence departments, and particularly the Interdepartmental Committee on Eastern Unrest, that other perspectives on Islam and Muslims prevailed. Important in the context of this wide lens perspective is John Fisher's 2000 article, which notes that the Foreign Office lost interest in the committee relatively quickly, noting disparagingly that a case of Icelandic threat could be made with enough circumstantial evidence. Without the support of this key department, the Interdepartmental Committee on Eastern Unrest therefore had limited influence in the very policy areas it was seeking to engage with. Matthew also perhaps overestimates the extent to which the British were able to influence or control events. The range of events, personalities, and issues that were swirling about in this interwar period are vast, and any one of them could have been the subject of books and papers, and indeed they are. From the question of what to do about the defeated Ottoman Sultan Caliph and the Khilafat movement, to the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the growing calls for Pakistan in conjunction with the independence movement, there are a bewildering array of events and incidents to unpack in order to get a sense of how Islam and Muslims were seen through the experiences of politicians and officials in this period. Those that have been chosen because of their containability and the light that they shed upon the perspective that Matthew offers. And the first of these events we will discuss concern the negotiations over the Kuwaiti oil concession. The first suggestion of an alternative paradigm to Matthew in play in relation to British relationships with Muslims in Islam comes through the lengthy negotiations which took place to secure the Kuwaiti oil concession agreement. Negotiations which lasted through the 1920s into the early 1930s. To contextualize, oil had been discovered in Persia by William Reynolds in 1908, but it was Winston Churchill's decision as First Sea Lord to switch the British Navy from coal-fired oil shortly before the break of the First World War, which brought oil into significant usage in Britain. The British government became the major shareholder in Anglo-Persian Oil Company, setting the seal on British interests in the Persian region. As Roger Addleston observes, that decision turned the Persian Gulf into, quote, a British lake, close quote. Even before that momentous decision had been taken, though, the discovery of oil in Persia had prompted the APOC to expand its horizons. For that reason, they had already made inquiries of the political resident as to whether an oil concession was available from the ruler of Kuwait, Mubarak as-Sabah II. Indeed, that they had even managed to secure an agreement with Mubarak II through the political resident, which said that no Kuwaiti oil concession would be given except to a person nominated and recommended by the British government. This is interesting in itself, insofar as the British documents are very careful to express that Kuwait was under the protection of Britain, but that it was not a protectorate. There was great emphasis about Kuwait being seen to be independent. This was an independence that the Kuwaiti Sheikh took full advantage of. Initial attempts to rapidly secure all the oil interests in the region fell short. First World War stalled progress on the development of the agreements with the rulers of Kuwait to the extent that negotiations did not resume until 1923. Captain William Henry Shakespeare, an officer in the Indian political service, acted as the political agent, initiating APOC's negotiations for oil concession agreement with Ahmed al-Jaber as-Sabah, who had come to the throne following the death of his brother Salim in 1921. The following year, APOC's negotiating rights for the Kuwaiti oil fields agreement lapsed, and they were quickly acquired by the American firm Gulf Oil Corporation, GOC. The United States requested the right of equal freedom in negotiations with the Kuwaiti ruler. Seeing their negotiating power weakening, Britain agreed to an American request for an open door policy for American oil in Kuwait. Sheikh Ahmed emerged as a wily and astute negotiator in the records as he successfully played the British and Americans off against one another in order to secure the best deal. In the end, both APOC and the GOC merged to mine the oil field jointly, and in the process created the Kuwaiti Oil Company in 1934, when the Kuwait Oil Concession Agreement was signed by Sheikh Ahmed of Kuwait. The pathway to the agreement of the Kuwaiti oil concession was therefore long and complex. Its sheer length and complexity are a sign of the value placed on the securing of the concession by the British government. This is important insofar as it demonstrates that the British were keen to secure oil for their civilian and military needs, and they were so keen that the rulers of the Gulf states were able to properly negotiate rather than yield to British or Western military power. As such, the episode demonstrates the move away from the thinking of the days of what might be termed gunboat diplomacy to one in which Muslim rulers with valuable resources in their own lands were beginning to recognize the value of the assets they held, and furthermore, the political leverage that could come with it. These negotiations lasted through the period of the First World War treaty negotiations, the Caliphate movement, and the abolition of the Caliphate. And it's interesting to note that the British engagement with the Kuwaiti oil concession does not appear to have taken issues related to pan-Islamism into consideration. Of course, such considerations could be deemed irrelevant to this economic activity. but there would have been plenty of scope for bringing in Islamism from either the British or Kuwaiti side in order to influence negotiations. That the Kuwaiti Sheikh is entirely focused on securing the best deal possible for his new state, rather than seeking to negotiate as part of a team of states, such as happened later under OPEC, or perhaps under the umbrella of Pan-Islamic unity, is telling, inasmuch as it strongly suggests that, for Sheikh Sabah, Pan-Islamism was not something to be considered in this context. And for the British, even if they had expressed fears relating to Pan-Islamism in private, no official worries about it were expressed. In this sense, what the course of the Kuwaiti negotiations and its correspondence reveal is the extent to which economic considerations helped to inform the methodological nationalism. This is especially so in context of the competition to secure mineral resources from their erstwhile American allies. As such, it begins to build a picture of British government strategy which lay more independently of ideological concerns, and perhaps, therefore, begins to confine the influence of the thinking of the Interdepartmental Committee on Eastern Unrest and other intelligence-led thinking. The second issue we will discuss is the propaganda battle that the British conducted to oppose narratives that they were anti-Muslim. The novel Greenmantle, which was published in 1916, John Buchan's follow-up to his most famous and successful book, The 39 Steps, tells the story of a Germano-Ottoman plot to cause chaos in the Middle East and North Africa by creating a Mahdi figure who would rally Muslims to his cause against the Allies. The book is, of course, fictional, but it shows the ongoing worries that affected British officials and politicians during this period of the war. Buchan was a politician and diplomat who eventually became Governor General of Canada, and his intimate understanding of the inner workings of government enabled him to imbue his characters and storyline with the real concerns of the time. In the First World War, he worked for the War Propaganda Bureau, as well as writing for the Times newspapers. The fears that Buchan fictionalized did not dissipate at the end of the First World War. The rapid rise of the Khilafat movement showed British officials and politicians up to the Prime Minister Lloyd George himself the depth of Indian Muslim loyalty to the Ottoman Caliph Sultan. And even though the post had been abolished by Mustafa Kemal the year before without British involvement, the British were still well aware of the fact that the perception had been fostered before, during, and after the war that Britain was an enemy of Islam, despite the efforts of Prime Minister David Lloyd George's proclamation of the British Empire as the greatest Mohammedan power, on the basis that it allowed freedom for worship for all, including Muslims. Back early in the First World War, discussions at the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs between Monsieur Desclassés, French Foreign Minister, and Sir Henry McMahon concerning joint concerns about Turkey's entry into the war and possible effects on imperial Muslim populations are recorded in the British files. McMahon reported that Indian and Arab troops had been loyal, helped by the positive statements on Britain's behalf made by the Aga Khan and other Muslim notables. In this climate of positive feeling of Muslims towards the Allies, the British were keen to ensure that there would be no hint of any interference in Muslim internal affairs, such as the question of the Caliphate, if that positive state of affairs was to continue. Desclassés agreed. They then discussed pushing the publication of various publications by Muslims who supported the Allies for a wider audience, which the French also concurred with. One interesting signal of Muslim opinion that was discussed was whether the Caliph's name was mentioned at the khutbahs on Friday prayers. For McMahon asked Desclassés if the Sultan's name was being mentioned in the khutbahs in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Desclassés thought that they were, but in his capacity as Caliph, not Sultan. This question and its reply were significant because the mention of the Caliph's name in Friday prayers in mosque were a signal of the sense of loyalty that Muslims felt towards those who were in authority over them, and one indicator of the strength of pan-Islamic feeling. After the First World War, a letter from Sir Horace Rumpole, High Commissioner in Constantinople, to Lord Curzon in London raised similar concerns in the post-conflict world. Rumpole attached an appeal for a Muslim Congress that had been circulating and which had encapsulated these concerns. The appeal had been published in a Turkish journal, and the High Commissioner was clearly concerned about the effects of the appeal, for it was arguing that the, quote, Christian countries of Europe were enemies of Islam, and that Muslims needed to be unified against it. Rumpole observed that the appeal was part of the Kemalist regime's desire to keep the Muslim world on side, following Kemal's insurrection against the Caliph. Nevertheless, Rumpole was convinced that the charge held weight with a good many people, and that its apparently warm reception showed the underlying resentment against non-Muslim rule that existed in Muslim-majority parts of the British Empire. For that reason, the British had every desire to counter the narrative of anti-Muslim perception. An article in the French newspaper Temps on September the 12th, 1914, unfortunately lent further credence to that concern, and it suggested that the war against the Turks was a crusade. Unsurprisingly, both governments sought at once to counter the concept of anti-Muslim bias by showing that both countries in which Muslims were able to live freely and worship freely, and it was in this connection that the building of a mosque in both London and Paris were discussed for their propaganda value. Yet it wasn't until well after the end of the First World War that activity in connection to mosque building began in earnest. A letter from Amir Ali, dated March 1927, on behalf of the London Mosque Fund to Sir Arthur Herzl, sought to enlist the help of the British government in funding the building of a mosque in London. The letter revealed that the London Mosque project had been a developing concern since before the First World War. According to the letter, the project had begun in 1910, when letters were sent to preeminent persons such as the Nazim of Hyderabad, Ahmed Shah, ex-Shah of Persia, and the former Sultan Caliph of Turkey, then in exile in Cyprus. But none of these had produced the funds required for the project. Coming to the British government was a natural next step for Ali, especially as he must have sensed that the British government was keen on ensuring good relations with the Islamic world, for he concluded his letter with a plea that played to the propaganda value of Her Majesty's or His Majesty's government's assistance with mosque building. Quote, "We know your Majesty has, at heart, the promotion of Islamic culture," close quote. Whether Ali truly believed that or whether he was seeking to gain advantage is difficult to say. But it's noticeable that from the turn of the 1920s into the 1930s and beyond the war period, British officials and politicians sought to counter the perceptions of anti-Islamic views through a series of exhibitions about Islamic culture in Britain, such as the highly successful exhibition of Persian and Islamic art at Burlington House in London in 1931. They also gave approval for funds to be allocated for the purchase of a site and the building of a mosque in London for its propaganda value. It was Winston Churchill's wartime cabinet which finally approved the £100,000 grant, which was used to purchase the land and build a mosque at two sites, Mile End and Regent's Park. At the same time, British officials very quickly reacted, British officials reacted very quickly to shut down anything in the public sphere that could be deemed as insulting to Islam or Muslims. There is not the space to discuss this at length here, but two cartoons which portrayed Muhammad, published in what the publishers believed to be humorous context in 1925, were swiftly retracted and apologies printed in the papers concerned. It's clear, therefore, that the propaganda effort was taken extremely seriously throughout the interwar period. One of its most long-lasting effects was the creation of two mosques, which continue to play key roles in the life of Muslims in Britain today. In relation to Matthew's article, it's interesting that pan-Islamic sentiment does not appear to be so much of a consideration in the internal discussions around the incidents and issues I've described. But what is apparent is the extent to which the opinions and goodwill of Indian Muslims particularly are considered very carefully. In one sense, especially given the ongoing advocacy of the Khilafat movement and the visit of its leadership to Westminster in 1920 and 21, it could be argued that pan-Islamism is present by implication rather than explicitly. However, it's noticeable that Indian Muslim opinion is present explicitly in the discussions throughout the period in the way that, for example, Arab Muslim opinion, or what is perceived as pan-Islamic sentiment, is not. As such, the consideration around the propaganda issues, whilst encompassing all Muslims at one level, certainly tilts strongly towards the views and opinions of Indian Muslims in particular. This dynamic is further evidenced by the conscious effort that British officials made to strengthen the hand of Indian Muslims as a way of undermining the growing Indian independence movement in the 1930s, perhaps the clearest example of which was the passage into law of the 1937 Sharia Act, which treated the diverse Indian Muslim communities as a single group and effectively gave them a cohesiveness that strengthened the hand of Muslim politicians such as Jinnah, who claimed to speak for all Indian Muslims in the negotiations. So, whilst the concerns of Muslims in general are present in the discussions around propaganda, it is Indian Muslims in particular who are the focus of British concern and are talked about repeatedly in the files. The third and final incident to discuss is the conversion of St. John Philby to Islam in 1930. Philby converted to Islam in 1930 whilst working as a businessman in the Middle East, following his period as a diplomat in the region during the First World War. A letter from Cecil Hope Gill, the British agent in Jeddah, to W.G. Rendell in India, who forwarded the letter to the India office, mentioned Philby's conversion in the context of a concern that Philby might become a member of what he termed the Wahhabi Brotherhood. Hope Gill noted that Philby had been encouraged to write about his conversion by King Ibn Saud himself, as the two knew each other. Ibn Saud presumably wanted Philby to write about his conversion as an encouragement to other Europeans to gain support for his pan-Arab cause and to encourage further conversions to Islam. In this, he was sowing on fertile territory. Jamie Gillam observes in his book, Loyal Enemies, British Converts to Islam 1850 to 1950, that there was a hunger for Islam in upper-class British society that he explains thus, quote, "Discouraged by materialism and loss of the sacred in post-war society, they were motivated by translations and interpretations of the great works of Islamic metaphysics by Orientalists such as Reinhold Nicholson. His classic, The Mystics of Islam, was first published in 1914, close quote. In that sense, therefore, Philby was not unusual in his exploration of Islam. What made him of interest was his diplomatic background and the impact that might have on his allegiance as far as British interests were concerned. Hope Gill's concern was therefore not with Philby's conversion per se, but he was worried that Philby might be used as a pawn by Ibn Saud. In that connection, Hope Gill mentioned that Philby might become a member of the Ikhwan, and hinted at a degree of desperation and naivety about Philby's conversion, for he reported that Philby's conversion was slightly prompted by his business going badly and being out of money. His conversion almost certainly meant that he would get work. Apparently, the local Arabs had christened Philby slave of tuppence, rather than the name Abdullah that he had actually taken. Gill was convinced that Philby had no religious conviction at all. Hope Gill was clearly intrigued enough, though, to invite Philby for a personal chat. A further letter, August 1930, from Hopeville, highlighted that Philby had said himself that his conversion was not at all spiritual. Rather, it was a rejection of British policy in the Middle East. Philby decided to convert to express his commonality with the Arabs and all things Arabian. This letter was passed to the Foreign Office in London, who in turn made it known to Khan Bahadur Tazdak Hussain of the Home Intelligence Department in India, who had learnt from an article in the Pioneer of Philby's conversion. The Home Intelligence Department wanted to know why Philby had converted. Such was the apparent concern in official circles that the following February, Andrew Ryan of the British Consulate in Jeddah wrote to the Principal Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs concerning the matter. Ryan was particularly concerned that there had been press speculation that Philby had become a confidant of Ibn Saud himself, and in so doing had created the perception that the Saudis were being directed by the British, a dangerous accusation for the keepers of the holy places of Islam. The British had deliberately stayed notionally neutral in Ibn Saud's war against the Hashemites, but had secretly armed him and given him a pension. Ryan admitted to the Secretary of State that there was indeed a relationship between Ibn Saud and Philby, but he denied that Philby had any connection to the British government policy in the area. So it's clear that Philby's conversion had aroused considerable interest, not just within policy circles, but also further afield, for the general public as well. Yet, internal British correspondence does not evidence concern in relation to pan-Islamism, but instead was focused around two factors. Firstly, the fact that the conversion was drawing too much attention to British policy in the MENA region, or Middle East region, for his conversion appears to have been a form of protest rather than a spiritual change. Secondly, worries about where Philby's loyalties might lie as a result of his conversion. Such concerns were not peculiar to Philby. Accusations of being a traitor had been made in the British press concerning the expressed dual loyalty of Marmaduke Pickthall during the First World War, and even before the war, as Ron Greaves observes, "going Turk" was a phrase that was used to describe not only those who converted to Islam, but by implication became also a term that was used for those who rejected the conception of Britishness. In the context of this paper, therefore, it's clear that in the minds of British officials during the pre-Second World War era, there was a correlation between change of faith and potential for change of loyalty to the state. What animated the discussions amongst British officials was not the potential for Philby's conversion to have been the result of a change of allegiance towards pan-Islamism generally, but a concern about both the publicity it created around their activities in the Middle East and Philby's potential advocacy and activism for Arab causes. This subtle but important difference highlights the fact that whilst pan-Islamic activities such as the work of Shakib Arslan and the European Muslim Congress were active and ongoing, there appeared to be more concern at the activities of national level Muslim movements into which the conversion of Philby fitted, along with the Palestinian activism of Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. So these three incidents and the correspondence that they generate clearly relate to only a fraction of the diverse and complex interactions which took place between British officials and the Muslims in different parts of the empire, as well as in Britain itself. Nevertheless, it's hoped that they offer a sense of the considerations which underpinned British engagement with Islam and Muslims during this period. What conclusions can then be drawn, and can it help us to determine the truth of otherwise of Johann Matthew's contention about the impact of pan-Islamism on British policy considerations? It seemed clear from the incidents discussed above that whilst there was a consciousness of pan-Islamism, which was taken seriously enough to be the subject of intelligence operations and briefings. It was not the only consideration governing British policy towards Muslims. As was noted in the discussion concerning British negotiations with the Kuwaiti Sheikh, economics was a major consideration. Furthermore, the discussion of the propaganda highlighted the extent to which it was not so much general Muslim opinion that was of paramount concern, but that of the concern of Indian Muslims. That is not to say that other Muslim communities and states were unimportant. Clearly, that was not the case. Pan-Islamic concerns were important in a political and security context, and the views of Muslims in various places other than India were also important, as was seen in the discussion over Philby's conversion. But the methodological nationalism being described as a policy driver by Matthew perhaps lays too much emphasis on national engagement as a coordinated strategy to counter one issue, rather than British policy in this period being more disjointed and predicated upon a set of needs in a changing international environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean.